Good morning. Let's just begin with a few facts. More than 31,000 people have died of COVID-19 in Britain so far, and that is almost certainly a big underestimate. And while detailed international comparisons are difficult, that official death toll is higher than in any other European country and the second highest in the world. Ministers are being told that people here are still catching the disease at the rate of up to 20,000 every day. Now, later today, the Prime Minister is going to be making an address to the country about what his assessment is of where we are now. This morning, we are not going to do any silly second guessing about what he might or might not say. You can turn on and see for yourselves later on. But instead, we're talking to scientists and others about what we know and what we don't. Today I'll be talking to Professor Peter Horby, the man who probably knows more than anyone else in Britain about the search for a treatment for coronavirus, and to the statistician Sir David Spiegelhalter, an advisor to ministers often quoted by them. Talking of ministers, I'm joined by the Communities Secretary Robert Jenrick and by Labour's Shadow Health Secretary Jonathan Ashworth. And as the Premier League debates whether it can restart, by the chairman of Crystal Palace, Steve Parish. And we'll also talk about what people have been doing to pass the time during the lockdown. Baking with Prue Leith, who has advice for kitchen amateurs, and what to read with best-selling author Robert Harris. His latest book is about a future dystopian Britain worn down by disaster. Because we need something to cheer us up this morning. Reviewing the news, Politics Live's Joe Coburn and the editor of The Spectator, Fraser Nelson. Don't go away. We start with the headlines from Rachel Burden.
Thank you very much. Good morning. The government will abandon its stay-at-home message on coronavirus and replace it with advice to stay alert. Boris Johnson will make a televised address this evening where he's expected to announce a new warning system to track the threat of the virus. Andy Moore reports.
As the sun shone, police in Hackney in East London said they were fighting a losing battle to persuade people to stay at home. They said hundreds of people were out enjoying food and drinks. They tried to remind them that they should be only out for exercise. Boris Johnson will tonight outline how it will be eased very slowly and very cautiously. First, there will be another meeting of the Cobra Emergency Committee before his televised address at 7 o'clock. He's expected to announce a scale of coronavirus alerts similar to the system for terrorism. They will range from level 5 red to level 1 green. We're said to be currently at level 4, moving towards level 3. There will be a new slogan too: stay alert, control the virus and save lives. The government is emphasising that any changes to the lockdown will only be made with extreme caution.
Importantly, it is true to say that moving beyond COVID will be a gradual process, not a single leap to freedom. So when we do emerge, the world will seem quite different.
Yesterday, the government said another 346 people had died with coronavirus in all settings, bringing the total death toll to 31,587. A few days ago, the government said there were some problems with the lab system for testing coronavirus swabs. It's now emerged that 50,000 samples have been flown to America for analysis there. It's not known how long it will take for the results to come back. The UK has failed to reach the target of 100,000 tests a day for 7 days in a row now. But the government said testing overall was at a much higher level than it had been. Andy Moore, BBC News.
Barack Obama has called Donald Trump's handling of the coronavirus crisis an absolute chaotic. 1.2 million coronavirus cases and 77,000 people have died. Campaigners are calling for an inquiry into the impact the coronavirus is having on the UK's black and minority ethnic communities. More than 70 public figures have signed a letter to the Prime Minister. Black men and women are nearly twice as likely to die from coronavirus as white people in England and Wales, according to the Office for National Statistics. And that's all from me. The next news on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Back to you, Andrew.
Hello again, thanks. And now to the papers as ever. Front page of the Observer there, if you can see it. Little Richard, one of those people who created what we now call rock and roll, has died, turned to religion later in life, an extraordinary man. Very sad to see him go. Their headline, "No return to work until we feel safe," the unions tell Johnson. And there is a lot of worry inside the government. This is going to become a left-right issue as unions and others say, no, it's too early to go. An extraordinary picture in the Sunday Times here. There's the Prime Minister with a Costa Coffee cup in one hand, walking across St James's Park and being berated, it appears, by a passer-by. He looks a bit crestfallen by that. Mail on Sunday, Hancock, give me a break, bust up with the Prime Minister. Somebody inside the government is briefing very strongly and very personally against the Health Secretary. The blame game, I would suggest, is already beginning. The Sunday Express, virus threat still critical, and a rather worried-looking Boris Johnson on their front page. The Sunday Times, 100,000 people will die, it says, if the UK eases this lockdown too quickly. That's a warning from scientists, and Little Richard again there. And finally, not least, the Sunday Telegraph, stay alert. The Prime Minister's new message to the nation, again, Little Richard. And there it is, stay alert, control the virus, save lives. Joe Coburn, stay alert. What do you think it means?
Well, it's difficult to interpret exactly what the government wants people to do, but you and I know that in politics, clarity is absolutely critical when it comes to messaging to the public. Yeah. And I think what stay alert, control the virus and save lives indicates is that the government's in a quandary. Stay at home, clear. Protect the NHS, save lives. Lockdown, going into lockdown, led actually to a large extent by people, and people adhering to it worked. Coming out of it is proving much, much more difficult, and it's going to be cautious and careful.
I can understand exactly why they might drop the protect the NHS bit, because the NHS has survived this. It has not been overwhelmed. You've had the new hospitals, and the NHS has done rather well. I can see, but stay at home. Once you lose stay at home on the motorways and around the country, people will assume that you can leave home.
But then how do you ease these restrictions in any way? Because it's got to be gradual, the government has come to the conclusion that they're going to have to be a lot more cautious than perhaps some ministers would like. And people were expecting, if you remember Prime Minister's questions last week, there was an impression from Boris Johnson that actually there were going to be measures announced today when he speaks to the nation, published tomorrow in the House of Commons, that might have been more significant than we are now expecting. When you're doing something gradual, when you're expecting people to stick to the rules, but perhaps be a little more flexible, impossible to police, people will wonder what they can and can't do until, of course, we hear what the Prime Minister is going to say. And the obsession of the government is about keeping this R transmission rate below 1, and that is why they are using this strange phrase, stay alert.
Stay alert. It suggests to the entire country we're going to be wandering around in cat-like tread, staring at each other from the side of our eyes. Fraser Nelson, editor of The Spectator, there's a lot of politics behind this, and the politics is beginning to get quite angry, according to the Sunday Times and indeed the Mail on Sunday.
That's right, because a lot of, forget about the Tory backbenchers, even members of the government aren't sure what is the basis of the Prime Minister's decision. We read in the Sunday Times that the big turning point came when the SAGE scientific committee said that if he does, for example, allow us to hang out with one other family, then that might risk pushing the virus contagion levels back up. Now, what is the basis for that advice? It seems as if we're going back to the models of people, but ministers are by no means confident that these models are correct. So tomorrow, apparently, we're going to see published 50 pages of advice as to why the government has taken this decision. And ministers just feel in the dark. They'd like to know a lot more about why the Prime Minister is so confident in the ability of gauging exactly how far the virus spreads to a level of precision which seems to be at odds with what we've seen so far.
Tim Shipman, in his Sunday Times piece, argues that ministers feel this is the moment of maximum political danger about to happen now. And there's a phrase used by one anonymous official which says, we might be forgiven for making mistakes on the way into this, but we won't be forgiven for any mistakes on the way out.
That's right, and that underlines the mood of caution. People had thought that because Boris Johnson's a kind of liberal buccaneering sort of politician, he might be quite bullish about coming out of lockdown. Instead, it seems he's very cautious. He's the one trying to rein in the rest of his cabinet, the rest of his party, saying that if we put a foot wrong on the way out, we will pay a far higher price for that politically. Public opinion is still quite behind him. People are willing to forgive him for mistakes made, perhaps even the mistakes made in sending so many sick patients back to care homes. But if there is a second wave of this due to a government misstep, he thinks that he won't be forgiven for that politically.
And Fraser, just tell us a little bit about why you think this briefing is going on against Matt Hancock, because it seems very pointed and very personal.
Well, that's right. There was a little bit of annoyance about the way he said we're going to have 100,000 tests a day by the end of the month. And then that target was sort of fiddled in a way by posting out lots of tests. And now it's emerged for the last week, it hasn't been met at all. I guess in politics, there's a feeling that there's going to be a fall guy, and who should that fall guy be? So there has been briefing against Matt Hancock in general. I guess it's the same for most governments everywhere. Right now, in the government, as in with most households, tensions are getting pretty high, and there have been huge mistakes made by Public Health England in the provision of protective equipment, in the way in which the tests weren't up to where we wanted them to be. Sooner or later, people are going to start to ask, in a way they're not right now, whose fault was that? Yes. Who ultimately carries the can? Being the health secretary is a dangerous job in such circumstances. It certainly is. It feels
a little unfair for Matt Hancock because he's absolutely been working flat out all the time. They're all in it together. They've taken these decisions collectively. It seems a little mean that it's all his fault suddenly.
Yes, I'm not sure there's that much briefing against him. I mean, for example, the Mail on Sunday front page today, you've got Matt Hancock quoted saying, "Give me a break," to the Prime Minister. Now, that phrase, you can see circumstances where he might have said that. And I don't necessarily think this is out-and-out character assassination. It is just ministers who obviously are dismayed at the missteps made so far. Now, how far can that really be the responsibility of any a government minister? I guess the political blame game will start. But right now, I think we're just seeing pre-shots in what might be a more bitter war later on.
More spectacular later on. Joe, of course, the big question now is how we leave the lockdown. And the Observer front page is saying that trade union leaders are saying until it's absolutely safe, no way do we want our members to go back to work.
Well, and that is a real dilemma. We've just heard Fraser talking about mistakes that may have been made by the government over the provision of protective equipment. And the unions are saying, to use your words and from that headline, until we feel safe. Now, what does that look like? Well, there is no doubt that the polls over the last week or so have shown high levels of fear and anxiety. People did take to the stay-at-home message. Now they may be coaxed out of their homes. They don't want to go back to work, according to the unions, until they feel they can safely travel on transport and be protected at work. But there is always an element of risk, Andrew, when you decide to come back to work. And the unions are saying they want some more guarantees and reassurances over the environment.
It's a really, really hard dilemma for ministers. How do you stop people having parties and barbecues in the parks and all the rest of it, and at the same time coax people who really could be working safely back out of their houses?
Have died, and they want to make sure that they can reassure their members, particularly when it comes to schools.
And well, let's talk about schools, because without schools going back, of course, many workers can't go back either.
And that is the sequencing issue. So there have already been questions asked of the government at those daily briefings. Unless certain school years return, then the parents of those school kids can't surely go back to work. This story on the inside pages of The Observer is from a head teacher at a primary school. This is my 14th year as a head, and I have never felt so scared and vulnerable. And she outlines exactly what would be needed in order to socially distance her pupils at school, perhaps only 6 to a classroom, the anxiety of parents that mean perhaps they wouldn't send their children back. But actually, interestingly, on this edge of it are about countries who are sending school children, but it's already started there.
All right. Fraser, can I ask you about the other great issue I think people will be talking about this weekend is their summer holidays. And the Sunday Times and many other papers have done spreads because it seems that if the government is going to quarantine everybody coming into the country for 14 days, the aircraft industry feels that's the final blow for them, and holidays themselves will be very, very badly affected.
That's right. I mean, it's difficult. If Britain's quarantining people, it stands to reason other countries will too. So I think it's a pretty brave person who would book an expensive foreign holiday right now this summer. And the Sunday Times basically looks at this and says, you know, right now there's such little certainty, and it's not just the plans that are uncertain, it's whether the companies that you book travel with are going to still be solvent, if the hotel is still going to be running, even if the airline is still going to be flying in the summer. And the lack of the certainty now, mid-May, suggests that people aren't really going to be planning to go anywhere July and August. I think this is a time for boom in sales of tents, I think. Camping in Britain, cycling in Britain. I think we're going to have a Enid Blyton summer ahead of us.
Fraser Nelson, Joe Coburn of Politics Live, thanks both very much indeed. Well, the weather, it was verging on too hot yesterday, at least for fair-skinned, big-eared Scots with only a sparse covering of hair on the bonce. So what's the outlook? Over to Louise Lear in the weather studio. Louise, snow!
Hi there, Andrew. Well, here it is. Here is the perhaps the antidote. We've got some snow showers across Shetland at the moment. The cold air has arrived, not for all of us yet because of the Arctic, and with that cold front, the winds are set to strengthen as well. So at the moment, it's sitting across the north of England, as you can see quite clearly. Some outbreaks of showery rain, the same too for Northern Ireland. That early morning sunshine across the south, it's not going to last. The cloud arrives here later, the odd spot or two of rain by the middle of the afternoon. Behind it, bright and breezy. The winds strengthening behind that weather front, gusting in excess of 30 to 40 miles an hour. We could still see a few isolated showers to the tops of higher ground, turning wintry in Scotland. But the temperatures are going to struggle today, and you factor in the wind, it's going to feel chilly. 4 to 8 degrees across that east coast, maybe highest values into the mid-teens, but it's not going to last. Now, throughout the week, high pressure builds, so it will be pretty dry, but we stay in the cold air, the bluer tones generally across the country. The winds will start to fall light through the middle part of the week, though, and so hopefully, slowly but surely, temperatures get back to pretty much where they should be for this time of year from Thursday onwards. There you go, Andrew.
Back to jerseys and woolly socks. Now, football is meaningless, but it is magnificently meaningless. Those are the words of my next guest, and it encapsulates the debate that is raging about the Premier League. When should elite football in England restart? And how important is it in the grand scheme of things anyway? Football bosses will try to agree a plan at a crunch meeting tomorrow, and one of the people in the room, virtually of course, will be Steve Parish, chairman of Crystal Palace Football Club. Steve Parish, welcome. Just tell us a little bit about the importance of this meeting tomorrow.
Well, it's another part of the journey of trying to get football back. I mean, to answer your first question, football is entirely unimportant in the context of the public health crisis, and everything we do, that has to come first. But we're a business at the end of the day, and we support jobs and taxes and the economy. And we would be derelict in our duty if we didn't find a way to try and bring the game back. Now, it may prove beyond us. Obviously, we have huge challenges in order to get it back to complete this season, but we're planning to do so, and hopefully we have the German example going on now.
But Dynamo Dresden had one single case of COVID-19, and they've had to isolate their entire team and pull out of the German league immediately. So that just shows how vulnerable, how fragile going back is going to be.
Yes, no, I didn't say it's been successful. We're hoping it's successful.
All right.
And they can provide a blueprint. Clearly, we can see some of the early challenges. They may prove insurmountable, Andrew, but the concern for us, of course, is if they prove insurmountable now, then we may be in for a very, very extended period of not being able to play. And that has huge ramifications, obviously, for the game.
Now, we're obviously talking about the game restarting without the crowds, but nonetheless, if you are in the lower part of the league and you're worried about relegation, then this idea of playing on a neutral ground may feel very difficult for you. Lots of the clubs have protested about this because there is a well-documented home ground advantage, and if you're at the bottom of the league, to lose that advantage means you might be relegated. and that is going to be the big issue. So can I ask you whether you would compromise on the idea of all games being played in neutral grounds, allow some home ground advantage to get the league back to finish the season?
Well, it's certainly not my proposal that we play in neutral grounds. It's obviously on the grounds of public safety. One of the other issues we've got, along with player safety, which is paramount to staff safety, are crowds gathering outside stadia. The police at the moment have made it clear that they don't think that they can police every ground. Clearly, it's suboptimal. The whole thing, the moment the season stopped, the competitive integrity was breached. We will be going back to something that looks like our least worst option of playing. But all of those things, if we can get the game on, for me, are far better than stadiums. That would be preferable for everybody. But at the moment, that situation is with government and with the authorities and isn't with us.
Well, Crystal Palace is in the happy position, of course, of being mid-table at the moment, but Scott Duxbury, who's chief executive of Watford, said recently, "We're being asked to finish a competition that bears no resemblance to the one we started, which could end in a small club like Watford's time in the Premier League. Is this fair? Does it have any semblance of sporting integrity? Of course not."
Well, listen, we are not entirely safe from relegation, although it would take a confluence of events for us to be relegated, but it has happened. And I have enormous sympathy with Scott's position. Having said that, as I said, I think it may well prove to be the least worst option, because if we stop, and because the decision has to be taken that the end of the season was when we played the last game, that would be equally hugely unfair to the three clubs that are currently in the bottom of the division. So there are no easy answers. We have to work through it as a collective, and I think we will, and we'll come out with a consensus in the end.
Sergio Aguero, the Manchester City striker, has said that many players are simply scared of playing again. What would be your response if one of your players said, "Do you know what? I don't want to play, I'm too worried"?
Well, the first thing we need to do is we need to talk them through the risks. We need to make sure that they understand it. Equally, the players that currently do want to play, they need to fully understand what risks there are. We believe, the doctors believe, that in the round we can make the environment one of the, if not the safest workplaces. But if a player really doesn't want to play, then I can't imagine any circumstances where we would make a player play, and we have to take all that into account.
Yeah. OK. It's been estimated that to get the Premier League up and playing again would require 40,000 tests for players and staff and ground staff and all the rest of it. Are you convinced that 40,000 tests for football, and therefore those tests not being available necessarily for all NHS or care home frontline workers, is that a good use of resources, do you think, for the country?
Well, we will want assurances as clubs that we're not taking resources away from anybody. We absolutely must not do that. We've been told so far that these are private facilities that aren't being utilised for this particular public health crisis. We will obviously all want more clarity on that, and it's absolutely essential that that isn't the case, Andrew. We simply can't take tests away from anybody that's more needing than us.
Is it possible, do you think, that if the season can't be restarted and Premier League football just stays on the ice, as it were, we could see big clubs as well as small clubs going bust?
Well, we're not quite at the stage of going bust. One would hope that we could get football back in some way before the end of the year. But these challenges, as you're speaking about on your show, they do not seem, as much as we would all wish it, to be likely to go away anytime soon. So obviously it's a threat. We're essentially an events-based business with mass gatherings. So we are probably a long way down the track of an industry that can naturally get back to our normal state. So the TV companies and the broadcasters we have here are very supportive, but around the world there are different challenges for our broadcast partners. We know we'll be damaged coming out of this financially, because obviously we have no crowds, we have no match day revenue. That will go on for a long time. It's really about damage limitation and seeing what we can salvage, and hopefully we can get to a point where certainly no Premier League club is in that situation. But I think down the leagues where the gates and all of that kind of income is 50% of the money, things will get very critical very quickly.
It's one heck of a job. Steve Parish, thanks so much for joining us this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Professor Peter Horby chairs a crucial scientific committee advising ministers, the New and Emerging Respiratory Virus Threats Committee, Advisory, or NERVTAG it's called. He is also, when it comes to coronavirus, Mr. Treatments. He's currently running the world's largest randomised clinical trial for potential treatments for COVID-19. And I spoke to him just a little earlier, and I began by asking him whether we will get an effective treatment for COVID and when.
Treatments in many ways are easier if we're looking at drugs that are already used. So the trials that we're involved in are using what we call repurposed drugs. So they're drugs that are already on the shelf in the pharmacy. So if we can test those, if we show that they work, then we can give them immediately to everyone. You know, with vaccines, you're giving them to a much wider population. You're giving them to people who are not yet sick. So the risk-benefit balance is very different. So you need to be a lot more careful with new vaccines. But with drugs that already exist, if they work, then we can use them straight away. So I think there's a reasonable chance that we will find some drugs that work, you know, perhaps even this year.
Well, remdesivir, for instance, has been already authorised, I think, for emergency use in the United States, and people are talking more and more about this, which I think was originally an Ebola drug, as being something that's actually useful for COVID-19.
Yeah, so very recently, so two studies came out on the same day. There was one study from China. It was a small study, but it didn't really show any benefit. And coincidentally, it was on the same day, Anthony Fauci in the US announced the early headline results from the US trial, which seemed to show a benefit. So a reduction of about 5 days in the duration of hospital stay, which is great. They hadn't yet seen any benefit on mortality, but the final results are yet to be seen.
You talked about... Sorry, I'm so sorry. You talked about these drugs being available if they work, but remdesivir, I think, is not widely available at the moment. In fact, you weren't able to get enough for your own very, very large-scale trials.
Yes, I mean, there's these two sorts of drugs. There's the ones that are already available, the repurposed drugs, and then there's the experimental drugs. So remdesivir is not yet properly licensed for anything, so it's not yet available on the shelves.
Can you just explain to us how your trial works?
So the recovery trial it's a national effort, really, and I think in the UK we're in an excellent position, probably better than anywhere else, because we've got the NHS. We've also got a national research infrastructure. So we've managed to open the trial across the whole of the UK. So it's open in all the devolved nations. It's open in over 170 hospitals. So really, it's there for any doctors and any patients to enrol into the trial, which means we can get very big numbers. So we've now enrolled 9,500 patients into the trial, which makes it the biggest trial we believe anywhere in the world. So it really puts us in a very good position to get some very clear answers about whether these drugs are beneficial.
We've heard an awful lot about hydroxychloroquine. Is there any evidence at all that that works?
There's no reliable evidence. You know, we've got to be really clear that the anecdotes we hear and the very small studies really aren't good enough. If you're going to start treating very large numbers of patients with drugs that all have side effects, you have to be really sure that they work. So I would say the jury's completely out on hydroxychloroquine. And
this is the one. I'm so sorry. This is the one that President Trump was advertising from his podium in the White House.
That's right. You know, I think that was well, it was just, you know, in a sense, almost reckless. You know, this has well-known side effects. There are cases of people poisoning themselves with this drug. It really shouldn't be used unless you've got good evidence that it works. And so we should tell patients that there are drugs that may work. If they want access to them, the best way is through trials, because then we'll know for sure if they work or not.
Is there a danger that remdesivir, or whatever seems to be the lead drug after your trial, simply becomes incredibly expensive for the NHS? The company making it ramps the price up, everyone around the world wants it, and it becomes hard to get and incredibly pricey.
This is where it's important that there's a global solidarity around these issues. There should be no opportunity for drug companies making vast profits from these drugs. Everyone across the world, whatever their income, including in the poorest countries, should have access to drugs like this. And they need to be made, if they work, they need to be licensed out for generic production so that they can be made available to everyone at cost price.
And is it likely, from what you've seen so far, that actually in the end it won't be one single drug, but possibly a combination of 2 or even 3 drugs that are being used widely?
So COVID has a sort of two aspects to it. You've got the virus and the viral replication, and we have antiviral drugs to sort of kill the virus, stop it replicating. But there's also a lot of inflammation, and so we have other drugs that target the inflammation. And you need both, I think. I think the best approach, therapeutic approach, will be a combination of one or more antivirals. You may need more than one antiviral to stop resistance, plus something that dampens down the immune response to the virus.
So, Professor, you're chair of NERVTAG, this very important committee. The Sunday Times reports this morning that warnings about the potential death toll have been sent to ministers by scientists. And if we get the unlocking wrong, there could be 100,000 deaths in Britain this year.
We have to be clear that this is not like a storm where we batten down the hatches and then it passes by and then we walk out into the sunshine and it's gone. It's still out there. Most of us have not had this virus. And so if we get this wrong, it will very quickly increase across the population and we'll be back in a situation of crisis. So we have to be incredibly cautious about relaxing the measures.
Now, I want to ask you about this R number. On television and elsewhere, we talk about the R number with great confidence, but that depends, presumably, it's the rate of spread of the infection, on knowing exactly how many people in this country have been infected. And since we don't know that, the R number is presumably, question mark, at best, a guess.
It's an estimate, yeah, and it's based on all sorts of data sources, all of which are imperfect, and you try and put them all together to get the best idea. And we always put confidence limits around our estimate. We say we think it's, at the moment, say 0.6, 0.7, but it could be anywhere between 0.5 and 0.9. And really, what we need to focus on, what's critically important, is improving the information streams. We need to get data much quicker on the number of people that are infected in the community. That will allow us to have a much more precise idea of what's happening, and then we can calibrate the public health response so that we keep it under control.
And we're now hearing about the R number in different parts of the country. Clearly, London is much more infected than other parts of the country. Is there any realistic chance of having, as it were, a city or regional breakdown so people in Norwich or Wales can know about the rate of infectivity in their area?
It's very difficult. The overall, R number is a composite of actually what's lots of small epidemics. You've got epidemics in the community. You've certainly got epidemics in nursing homes and in the healthcare settings, in hospitals, and there's regional differences. It becomes very difficult to break those down because they're so interlinked. And it may well be that there is different rates of transmission in different parts of the country, but because they're so interconnected, it may not make sense to have different interventions in different parts of the country.
Now, we know that your committee, NERVTAG, advised ministers last June to stockpile gowns, and they didn't. What should ministers be stockpiling now, looking ahead?
The personal protective equipment has obviously been a big issue. A lot of the planning was done around pandemic influenza. This has been more extensive, I think, than any of us were expecting any pandemic to be, particularly, I think, the issues outside of the healthcare setting as well, in nursing homes and places like that. So, but now, there are no excuses. We've really got a good idea of what we're facing, and we should be making sure that we have access to the highest quality PPE that we can get. I think there's a real serious global problem with supply issues, but hopefully that will be solved over the coming months.
Richard Horton, who's editor of The Lancet, had a bit of a go at government committees like the NERVTAG. He said most of the members or participants in SAGE, that key committee, are actually government scientists on the payroll of the government. We did not have truly independent scientific advice. This is a system which is corrupted. We do not have people who are truly able to give truth to power. Do you feel in your position you can properly tell truth to power?
Yes, I think he's mistaken there. I mean, there are a lot of government advisors who observe on the committees, and that's I think, right, so they can actually see what the deliberations are. They can understand the thinking process, the science, so that they can make their policies fully informed about what are the uncertainties and what the data are saying. The scientists on those committees are completely independent. They're seasoned. They're not intimidated by politics or politicians, and there's very robust discussions at those meetings, and there's frequently quite heated arguments. And to say that those people are somehow influenced by the politicians, I think is wrong.
So NervTag itself's been criticised after giving COVID-19 only a moderate risk assessment.
I think that has been a bit misunderstood. The risk assessment was, what's the actual risk right now to the people in the UK? And it's a risk assessment that's based on geography. So is the risk greater at that time in China or Italy than in the UK? And what is the risk going to do over time? And so that moderate was what was the risk on that day to people in the UK. And it changes all the time. And it also was not used as a trigger. So it wasn't used as a trigger for any action. Parallel to that, there was intense effort to respond to what we all knew was a major threat.
So it was the risk now, not the risk coming, to put it simply.
Yes, that's right.
Professor, thanks very much indeed for talking to us today.
Thank you very much.
Now, as we plod on through the lockdown, one thing people are turning to is baking as a form of therapy. Supermarkets up and down the country have been running low on flour. So unless it's being used to make papier-mâché sculpture, it's a fair guess that most of it is for cakes. But what do you do if you're a baking newbie, nervous about the whole business? Help is at hand, I asked Prue Leith, who's been putting up YouTube videos to help people get into baking, for her advice.
First of all, cooking and baking are really easy. You should just follow the recipe and guess what? It will work. So that's my main tip. But we're running less out of flour now. The real problem was packaging. They only had flour in huge, great bags for restaurants and for catering companies and bakers. And now they're managing to get it into smaller bags. So the flour is there.
It is there, but some people still haven't got it in their kitchens. So if you haven't got flour, but you want to bake, what should you do?
Well, my favourite non-flour cake, in fact, my favourite cake of all time, is the Italian polenta cake, lemon polenta cake. There are lots of versions of it, but I use the River Cafe one, which is unbelievably rich and delicious. It's actually got something like, I think it has 6 eggs and 4 lemons and a ton of butter. But the main thing is it has polenta, which is maize flour instead of flour, and it has ground almonds. And you can use ground up nuts instead of flour, chestnut flour and hazelnut flour and pistachio flour and all sorts of things. Not cheap nut flour, but ground almonds aren't too bad. And that cake is just wonderful.
There is something magical about baking and seeing it rise and something coming out of the oven. And lots of kids want to get involved. Is this something that you would recommend or not recommend for parents to try to get children involved in their baking?
Well, I've always banging on about children learning to cook and to bake because I just think it's so creative and it's good fun and it's something you can do together, or if you're alone in isolation, you can do it and take pictures of it and show it to your friends. It's a very satisfying thing, and besides which it's useful and you can eat it. And children love it. I have never, ever met a child who didn't enjoy cooking.
Now, you're a practiced broadcaster, but you've been doing social media videos about how to bake. Has that been a nightmare or quite easy?
Quite a nightmare. I'm not very good at all this, but my husband is getting really dab-handed being the cameraman. So it's getting a bit better. But to be honest, I haven't got the patience. You know, I'm so full of admiration for all those YouTube cooks who make the most amazing demonstrations and everything is perfect and the background is right and you know, the hands are in the right position and everything is perfect. You know, I can't be bothered. I just do it as I would normally do it, and it isn't always perfect. But the stuff tastes lovely and it works, so I think it's fine.
Given all these new social distancing rules and so forth, Prue, do you think it's going to be possible to do the Great British Bake Off this year?
I really hope so. Everybody's hoping so. But, you know, we're all waiting for Boris to tell us what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do. So certainly it's impossible at the moment because, you know, there are really a lot of people on set. But I'm sure they'll find a way as soon as they can. And they're determined to do it. Are
you determined to be part of it if it happens?
Oh, absolutely. I'd be very upset if somebody kicked me off. And I had to... last year I did Junior Bake Off and Senior Bake Off. Whether or not I'd be able to do both this time, I just don't think there's enough time in the year, so I'm not sure.
Well, Prue Leith, kick you off they wouldn't dare. Thanks so much for joining us on this lovely Sunday morning.
I really hope you're right.
Labour has been asking for more clarity from ministers ahead of Prime Minister's address this evening. The Shadow Health Secretary is Jonathan Ashworth. Jonathan Ashworth, welcome. We have seen this morning that the government in England has dropped the advice saying stay at home and replaced it with stay alert. What's your reaction?
Well, we know that the lockdown that we've been in for now 7 weeks, a lockdown that we have supported and continue to support, has helped us hospital admissions for the virus come down. It looks like the death rate, numbers of deaths is coming down. But we've always said that this virus is deadly. It spreads with speed. It can spread. It can be transmitted by asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic individuals. So when you're dealing with a public health crisis of this nature, you need absolute clarity from government about what the advice is. There is no room for nuance. And I think the problem with the new messages is many people will be puzzled by it. They won't understand what we mean by stay alert. So I hope we can get clarity from the government today as to what exactly this new message means, because this virus really does exploit ambivalence and thrive on ambiguity. We need clarity at all times. What do you think stay alert means? Well, I'm not entirely sure, because as Matt Hancock has said before, this is an invisible killer, and we know it is highly, highly deadly, this virus. Our death rate is tracking at one of the worst in Europe. It's particularly deadly for those from poorer backgrounds and those from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds. And indeed, those who catch the virus and survive, many will have long-term. Johnson can give us the clarity that we need, because when you're in a pandemic like this, you need people, and you're asking the public to adjust their behaviour. You need that clarity in your public health messaging. We always knew that getting out of the lockdown was going to be a complicated and difficult process. Labour has been calling again and again and again for a path out of the lockdown. So do you take a little bit of the responsibility for confused messaging at the moment? No. I mean. Oh, sorry, my iPad fell over then. No, but there was confused messaging this week, wasn't there? Where we saw different briefings to different newspapers, and that's why we've seen, for example, this weekend, people going to parks and more road traffic and more call-outs for our Coast Guards. But at the same time, I don't think it's unreasonable to ask the government what its strategy is for the coming weeks, because we know we need more testing and tracing infrastructure in place. That's what other countries who have been successful, like South Korea, put in place early on. We didn't put that in place. In fact, we abandoned our contact tracing. I'm sorry to jump in, but isn't there a contradiction between asking for clarity on the one hand and constantly asking the government to explain what it hopes might happen in the weeks ahead? Those two things are never going to be the same, are they? No, I don't think they can, because I think we can treat the public like they're grown-ups. I think we can offer the public clarity and explain where we are going with the virus. That is not the same as saying to people, oh, the lockdown might end on Monday, like was briefed to various newspapers this week. It's about understanding that we need a route map for how we transition out of the lockdown, because the lockdown, important as it is fundamentally a blunt tool. It is not the strategy in itself. And while we are in this lockdown, we are building up huge societal problems. It affects the economy, but lots of people are getting their treatments cancelled, cancer patients having their chemotherapy and radiotherapy delayed. And of course, taking children out of schools for so long also has huge implications for our young people as well. Indeed. So asking these questions, I think, are important and not unreasonable. Can I ask you what your view is about ending the lockdown differently in different parts of the country? Because I've been looking at the figures and they're really interesting. London has a mortality rate of 86 deaths per 100,000 people. Your own constituency, Leicester, has 34,000, so much, much lower. And you look at somewhere like Norwich, which is just 5 deaths per 100,000 people, and yet Norwich and Leicester and London are all being treated at the moment as if they are the same. Do you think there is a case for lifting the lockdown differently in different parts of Britain? Well, I think there's a case for targeted testing and tracing regimes. So, for example, we know that we have a higher proportion of deaths amongst deprived communities, usually in urban areas, in overcrowded accommodation. And yet our targeting strategy at the moment is just basically hitting a big number. They wanted to hit 100,000 and they hit that last week, but the figure has drifted down ever since. So I think you can target your testing and tracing at certain sections of your community, deprived areas, Black and Asian minority areas, but also certain cohorts of your workforce. We should be testing every healthcare worker, for example, whether symptomatic are asymptomatic. We should be testing everybody in a care home. Some of the issues about having a lockdown in one bit of the country and not in another bit of the country is that when that approach was attempted in Italy at the start of their outbreak, lots of essentially middle-class people went from northern Italy to southern Italy and took the virus with them. So it doesn't, those sort of locking down bits of the country, not locking down other bits of the country doesn't work. But what you need to do is be more sophisticated in your testing and tracing infrastructure.
Meanwhile, Labour has introduced a new policy of your own, which is that people renting who fall in arrears should be given 2 years before they have to pay them back. And a lot of your own supporters, a lot of people in the Labour Party feel this is far too cautious, and actually such arrears accrued during COVID-19 should be written off completely.
I think the issue is that as we come out of this COVID crisis, society cannot be the same again. It shows that we need more public and more contracts. So we need to have a debate about the country about how we rebuild our country when we come through this. But in the meantime, we need to put in place measures that support people to get through this, because a lot of people are going to find themselves financially and economically worse off as a result of this lockdown, and they need to be supported.
Jonathan Ashworth, thanks very much indeed for joining us this morning. Now then, if you've been watching the daily press conferences or Prime Minister's questions this week, you will have heard the name Sir David Spiegelhalter. He's a statistician who's advised the government's SAGE committee on COVID-19 and is much quoted by ministers about the difficulties of making international death comparisons. I spoke to him just before we came on air and asked for his best estimate of how many people in this country have had.
We've had maybe, 35,000 deaths from COVID-19. People would say that the infection fatality rate, that's the proportion of people who get infected who go on to die, is on average probably less than 1%. But let's say it's 1%. That multiply those up, which I'm sure you could do in your head, you get 3.5 million people infected in this country with the virus, and that looks like that's a minimum. But of course, it could be much higher than that. People say the infection fatality rate might be half of that, which would mean there would be about 7 million people, at least in this country, that have been infected. And it is extraordinary. And some people are claiming half the country has been infected. It is extraordinary that we don't know these basic facts yet. And we've heard now from Ian Diamond, the head of the Office for National Statistics, that they have finally got asked to do a proper survey. April 17th, they finally got asked to do it. And we're going to start getting the results, looks like this week, of how many people have got it and how many people have had it. And I think it's extraordinary that we've had to wait this long for this most basic information. And I think that's the one bit of criticism I am willing to make about the government, is the fact that the testing, has been the development of the testing has been so delayed.
So I gather the most useful figure probably at the moment is the number of excess deaths per week or per month at the moment. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I think that is the most useful figure to look at. And if we look at over the last 4 weeks of the data available for the Office for National Statistics, which is the reliable source of information, goes up to just April the 24th. So this is still 2-week-old data. We can see that instead of over those 4 weeks, with the 42,000 deaths we'd normally expect at this time of year, in fact, we observed 79,000. That's nearly double. That's 37,000 extra deaths. But only 27,000 of those had COVID-19 on the death certificate. And that leaves about 10,000 extra deaths, running at about 3,000 a week, which are kind of unexplained. And this is the mystery. What has caused these extra deaths? And they're undoubtedly there, an undoubted spike in non-COVID excess deaths. Now, some of them will be under diagnosis, where the doctors were not willing to put it on the death certificate. But Sir Ian Diamond last week in your programme was quite clear that he was attributing much of these to what's called the indirect deaths, or the collateral damage, the damage caused by the disruption to the health service. And this is so clear when we look at the data from care homes and at home and people's homes. There's been a massive shift of deaths from hospitals into care homes and homes. And that is not necessarily a bad thing, that people can die in more familiar circumstances, but there's also a lot of additional deaths happening out of hospitals that we wouldn't have expected at this time of year. More than half the deaths in care homes, which are running at 3 times the normal rate, are not being labelled as COVID. And it seems to me this is unbelievably important. These are just short-term, immediate deaths. due to people not going to hospital, not calling the ambulance when they're ill, and so on. And that, of course, is let alone the damage that's being done in the longer term by the lack of chemotherapy, radiotherapy, elective surgery, and so on. The disruption to the health service is, I think, when we look back on this, will be seen as a massive issue.
Now, you had a slight run-in with the Prime Minister last week when you criticised him for quoting you in terms of the uselessness of international comparisons. So let's hear your actual view.
Okay, my view. I wrote an article for The Guardian because I'd got so fed up with this sort of, I think, rather media-based competition about who's top. Is it Britain or Italy? That's the worst. And I just wanted to say that because of the enormously different ways that different countries were reporting their data, that is a completely fatuous exercise to do a sort of Eurovision between who's the worst in Europe. But I should have made much clearer that what I was talking about was the comparisons between essentially the bad countries in Europe, UK, Belgium, France, Spain, Italy. I was not saying, that we can't make any comparisons at all, because clearly it's important to note that we as that group is way above, in terms of their mortality, above a group like Germany, Austria, Portugal, Denmark, Norway, who have low fatality rates. If only to say that what's happened in this country is not inevitable. It doesn't mean it had to happen. And I wasn't very clear about that. And then I found that my paper was being quoted by ministers to support the claim that we can't make any international comparisons. And I thought it'll go away. But finally, Boris Johnson said that I used this in a response in parliamentary questions, and I felt forced, and my colleagues encouraged me to actually go public and say, please don't do this. This is not what I meant. Don't use this to make this claim that we can't make comparisons. And I tweeted that out, and it's my one and possibly only viral tweet with over 10,000 retweets.
So you said it wasn't inevitable that we had that number of deaths. And that then leads to, are we talking about policy, or are we talking about the clustering of people in London and other issues?
There are so many reasons why countries can differ, and that, let alone the policy. The age distribution, I didn't realise in Ireland, 6% of the population is over 75, and in Italy, double that, 12% of the population are over 75, and this is a disease of the over 75s almost completely. So I think that these are all many comparisons. We're a densely populated country, all sorts of things, but there's still, and so making these fine comparisons is extremely difficult indeed. However, when you see really massive differences between countries, then it is really worth trying to investigate why. But I'm not saying why.
All right. You mentioned there it's a disease of the over 75. So let me ask you another, again, straightforward sounding question. How scared should most of us be of dying of COVID-19?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because as lockdown is released, we're going to be, this is turning from essentially a societal threat into risk management. And so I think it's very important that we are aware of what the risks are. I'm not saying how anybody should feel or what they should be worried about, but I suppose my aim as a statistician was that people's anxiety should be at least roughly proportional to the actual risks that they face. And I've been looking at some data. Do you want some numbers? Come on, I'm going to give you some numbers. Whether you like them or not. Right. So Office for National Statistics had reported nearly 30,000 COVID deaths up to April the 24th. Okay, let's look at a young group. People are anxious about children. Now, there's 10 million under 15s in England and Wales. Now, how many of those have died and had COVID on their death certificate out of these 30,000 who have died with COVID?
Tell me.
2 out of 10 million. Now, and it's very tragic cases. I suspect they might have had something else wrong with them. Okay, so that's 2 out of 10 million. This is the tiniest risk you could ever think of. And so I do think that when people start talking about protecting our children, this is a bit of a delusion. Obviously, I'm talking about risks to the individual themselves. We have to think about the potential for spreading the virus, and that's absolutely vital. But when we're talking about personal risk, for young people, it's staggeringly low. If you look at under 25s, there's 17 million of them in the country. We have had 26 deaths recorded. Again, many will have had other conditions. That's still just 1 or 2 per million. That's about the risk we face in over a couple of days of general accidents and sudden death. So this, again, is completely trivial. Let's compare it with the over 90s. No more than 1% of the over 90s in this country have so far died from COVID, just in 4 weeks, essentially. So that's a substantial proportion. That is 10,000 times the risk of the younger people. Now, it's very difficult to communicate that staggering gradient in risk. You can start talking to people and say, well, the risk doubles roughly every 6 or 7 years. And so you can just see it multiplying up and multiplying up. But, you know, it's my job, people like me, to try to do this.
So we're talking about the over 70s and the over 75s. A lot of this is about how well the communication is done. And we're now very familiar with these daily press briefings. How well are they working, do you think?
Well, I watched yesterday's, and frankly, I found it completely embarrassing. We get told lots of big numbers, imprecise numbers of tests being done, 96,878. Well, that's not how many were done yesterday. That includes people that were posted out, tests that were posted out. We're told 31,587 people have died. No, they haven't. It's far more than that. So I think this is, you know, actually not trustworthy communication of statistics. And it's such a missed opportunity. You know, there's the public out there who are broadly very supportive of the measures. They're hungry for details, for facts, for genuine information, and yet they get fed this, you know, what I call number theatre, which seems to be coordinated really much more by, you know, a number 10 communications team rather than genuinely trying to inform people about what's going on. I just wish that the data was being brought together and presented by people who really knew its strengths and limitations and could treat the audience with some respect.
Sir David, thank you very much indeed for that. The best-selling novelist Robert Harris is working on a new novel about Britain during World War II, but his latest, Second Sleep, is about a future Britain which has been returned almost to the Middle Ages by some unnamed catastrophic event. Who better to talk about reading and writing during this disaster?
It's a book that's sort of been at the back of my mind for a long time to write. It's sort of set in when you start reading it, I'll have to give this away, I'm afraid. When you start reading it, you think you're in the past, and then gradually it becomes apparent that you're in the future, and some terrible calamity has occurred that seemed a rather longer shot than it does now.
Yes, and you keep the disaster ambiguous. We don't know what it was, but it could have been a pandemic. And in fact, you looked, I think, into preparations for pandemic when you were writing the book.
Yeah, the characters in the novel, they discover for 500-year-old cache of documents, one of which is a letter from a government scientist warning Whitehall to take heed of the threats that the country faces, existential threats, one of which is listed as a global pandemic. The gist of it is that this guy is convinced that we're not doing enough to safeguard ourselves. And the characters in the novel in the future set out to retrace his path.
We've just had the 75th anniversary of VE Day, and you are sitting there, I think, working on a book about the Second World War again. You're returning to the Second World War. How has writing been affected by lockdown? Made much easier, one assumes, because there's fewer distractions?
No, on the contrary. I mean, you're right in one sense. In my working pattern is I write a novel generally between January and the end of June. And so I would have been in lockdown effectively at this time. But it relies upon the rest of the world functioning, actually. I mean, I lock myself away for the mornings or work until about lunchtime. And then I need to see people and I need to go out and go to a restaurant and get a sense of life, you know. If it's just permanently quiet, then it becomes much more of a strain. And I have found it quite difficult. I think sleeping is quite difficult.
The bird song becomes infuriating eventually. Now, can I ask you about what you're reading as well, Robert? Because a lot of us are sort of sitting there, we've got time on our hands, and we're looking at great novels or great novelists of the past or short stories, filling in things that we haven't been reading before and using the time. What's your advice?
Well, I mean, I have been having to read a lot of novels about books about the V2, which is not much use to anybody else. But apart from that, the one that I really will associate with lockdown is Craig Brown's new book about the Beatles, 1, 2, 3, 4, because it reminds one of a sunnier, happier time. Of youth and optimism, and also the way Craig has written it with sort of mosaic style, short chapters, anecdotes, makes it quite good to read at this time, because I find it's quite hard to concentrate on anything very substantial. So that I would recommend. That's been a good solace to me.
you're a man whose professional life involves looking ahead a lot. So can I ask you, what are your hopes and fears for the future at the moment?
Well, I'm by nature an optimist. I think that we will come out of this. I think we will taper out of it. There won't be some great day like VE Day where, you know, we're all out in the streets and celebrating it's over. I think we're going to live with it for a long time. But I think we will come out. So to that extent, I'm optimistic. I'm slightly pessimistic about a virus. One thing about writing about wars has taught me, about a vaccine, I should say, one thing that writing about wars has taught me is that at the beginning of a crisis like this, people always make their hope their prediction. And so they always said it will be over by Christmas. Nobody ever forecast the war would be longer than it turned out to be. So I think that this may go on for a long time. We may not even get a vaccine, but we'll adjust to live with it because we're a species that survives by cooperation and indeed by courage.
A courageous and cooperative species. Robert Harris, thanks very much indeed for talking to us this morning.
Thanks, Andrew.
Well, I'm joined now by one of the public faces of the government throughout this lockdown, the Communities Secretary, Robert Jenrick. Robert Jenrick, the government has dropped its original stay-at-home message and has substituted stay alert. What does stay alert mean?
Well, good morning, Andrew. And at 7 o'clock tonight, the Prime Minister will lay out a roadmap for the next phase of the virus. We've passed the peak, and so we do think this is the right moment to update and to broaden the message. So stay alert will mean stay alert by staying home as much as possible, but stay alert when you do go out by maintaining social distancing, washing your hands, respecting others in the workplace and the other settings that you'll go to. This will be a cautious message because the rate of infection is still high and the public are understandably anxious.
I suppose that this is only for England. Scotland and Wales will keep stay at home as their message.
We would like the whole of the United Kingdom to move as one. That's our strong preference. The Prime Minister will lay out this message for the whole country tonight, but obviously Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland can choose to take different approaches if they wish to.
Here is why. I mean, Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, has said on Thursday, for us to drop the clear, well-understood stay-at-home message right now could be a potentially catastrophic mistake.
Well, staying at home will still be an important part of the message. We want people to stay at home as much as possible, but when they do go out, to work or to shop or to look after the vulnerable, to do so by respecting social distancing. And one of your previous contributors said there's no place for nuance. I disagree with that. I think that the public are capable of understanding a broader message as we move into the next phase of the virus. We're going to be living with the virus in one form or another, hopefully declining for some time. So we need a more nuanced message, and that's what the Prime Minister will lay out later today.
Well, already up and down the country, as you have seen, lots of people are ignoring the lockdown. Why do you think that is?
Well, some people are, but the vast majority of people have adhered to the social distancing guidelines, have stayed at home, and that's been very important to the progress that we've made, that we have now passed the peak of the virus, that the rate of infection is reducing within the community. There remains, as you've heard on the programme, a very serious issue in care homes. But I'm grateful to the public for their forbearance so far. And we're hopeful that and confident that this new message will also be abided for and that people will take a vigilant approach in going about their daily lives.
Well, I said lots of people are ignoring the lockdown. Let's just look at the tweet that was put up by the Hackney police in East London. Sadly, we are fighting a losing battle in the parks today. Literally hundreds of people sitting, having pizza, beers, wines. As always, a big thank you to those observing the guidelines. That is the scene from Hackney. And again, I say, why do you think that's happening?
Well, throughout the lockdown measures, you have been able to draw up scenes of particular parks or beaches or locations. These are actually rare. The vast majority of people have obeyed the guidelines, and you see that in the statistics, for example, of the number of people who have been issued with fines, which is low across the country. Overall, the police have been able to maintain the social distancing guidelines during the lockdown by consent, because people have wanted to obey this, and that's important. Well, I do also think that it's important that parks are available, because if we're going to have these measures continuing, we want to make sure they're as livable and as bearable for people as possible.
Sure, but I mean, the Coast Guard, for instance, who look at the coast all around the country, of course, they say people are ignoring the measures put in place by the government. I ask you why, and I'm going to give you a possible answer. Let's just look at Thursday's newspaper headlines. There we go. Magic Monday. Hurrah, lockdown freedom beckons. Happy Monday, lockdown will be eased next week, and so on and so on. Did any government briefing contribute to those headlines?
Well, I don't know. It's certainly not. It's certainly not something that. It's certainly not something that I've been involved in, and I hope not. But you and others have been asking for the government to lay out a strategy for the next phase of the virus for some time, and that's exactly what the Prime Minister will do tonight. But I would just stress again, staying at home will remain an absolutely essential element of that strategy, but it will broaden out and will encourage people to stay alert when they're going about their business, when they're going to work, for example, if they have to. And that's important, because if we're going to be living with this for a while, we've got to ensure that people remain socially distanced, wash their hands, take all of those other steps, as well as simply staying in the home.
I showed you, I think, 6 front-page headlines across the national press. You and I have both been around a bit. We both know perfectly well that 6 newspapers would not have put that message on their front page without a clear steer from the government somewhere.
Well, I'm not going to preempt what the Prime Minister will say this evening.
I'm not preempting.
However, this will be a cautious approach. There will be no grand reopening of the economy tonight. There will be a message of caution, of personal responsibility, being vigilant and staying alert. And by doing that, we will help to control the virus. And in time, not today, but in time, we'll be able to gradually reopen the economy and the other aspects of our lives. None of us want to see the lockdown continue for one day more than is necessary. Today isn't the moment to do that, but we will be setting out the plan. And at each stage on that road, each milestone will be conditional upon keeping the rate of infection to a manageable level.
This was disastrous mixed messaging as far as a lot of people in the country are concerned. Your own advisor, Sage, said it's incredibly damaging to have bits and pieces of information leaked. Sections of society may take this as we'll do what we want because it's all changing on Sunday anyway. Once the lid is taken off and people break the rules, they'll be much more likely to carry on breaking them. And that is the response after headlines like that. I ask you about the Prime Minister himself, who said in the House of Commons, we will want, if we possibly can, to get going with some of those measures on Monday. This has not been a very astute piece of messaging, has it?
Well, I think the public will have to tune in to listen to the PM tonight. As I say, he's taking a very cautious approach, which reflects the fact that the rate of infection is still high, particularly in some settings like care homes, the understandable anxiety of the public, and we'll have to give confidence to people to go back to work or to other aspects of life in due course. But the very clear message of the government is that that isn't where we are now. There's still some way to go. And so please be vigilant, stay alert, and by doing that we'll help to control the virus.
You set this very important target of 100,000 tests a day. Over the last 7 days, for how many days have you hit that target?
Well, we hit it on the date that we said we would and the following day. Every other day we've fallen just short of it. Capacity is over 100,000 and that's important. We want that to rise to 200,000. I think it is worth saying we've come a long way with this. You know, at the end of I think February we were 2,000, March 10,000, April around 100,000. So we are moving in the right direction, but of course there's more work to do there.
In 7 days you didn't hit it once. And you say capacity is available, in which case why have you had to send 50,000 tests to America to be checked?
Well, those are two different states to be processed and the results brought back to the public. And I think, if anything, that just shows our determination to get the job done. We had a contingency plan. We put that in place as soon as there was an issue with the lab that was otherwise going to be processing the results. And we did that so that the public, who were waiting for the results, could get them as quickly as possible. And that was the right thing to do.
Well, you see, it's two different issues, but a test doesn't mean much unless you can actually read the results properly. So what was the problem with the laboratory?
There was a temporary failure at that laboratory. We've had one with 2 laboratories now, different issues. But in each case, as you'd expect, there is a contingency plan. And this contingency plan, you know, was a very well worked through one. It was to get the test to the United States, have them processed there, get the results to members of the public as quickly as possible. Carol
Ann Doherty, who was one of those people involved in the test, said on on yesterday, she just said, still awaiting test results that were collected from us last Saturday. This process is beyond ridiculous. My husband is a key worker who can't work till results are back. This process has been one disaster after another. And Carol Ann is not wrong, is she?
Well, I'm sorry to hear her experience. I don't obviously know the individual circumstances there. I've heard positive feedback, for example, for those people who've gone to the mobile testing sites. We have almost 100 of those now. Their locations are being focused on places that are accessible for care workers, for example, and the experiences that I've heard as local government secretary, people going to those, particularly the ones that are manned by members of the armed forces, have been extremely positive. There's clearly work to do here. I'm not going to dress up the challenges that we've faced, but the capacity for tests has increased enormously, and we're now building the network that we need for track and trace, whether that's through the app that's being piloted in the United States.
On the app, since you mentioned it, are we developing a second app at the moment, which will be a different kind of app?
We have an app that's being rolled out on the Isle of Wight, but we are also paying attention to what's happening elsewhere in the world. This is a pilot in the Isle of Wight. We're trying to get as many people to sign up to it as possible. We have around 50,000 people who've downloaded it.
I'm sorry, can I just ask very specifically, are you looking at a second app or not?
We are learning lessons from the other apps that exist elsewhere in the world, and if we need to change our app, we will do. That's the point of piloting this before we take it national across the whole country. But I'd like to say thank you to the people on the Isle of Wight for signing up. We have, I think, around 40% of the population of the Isle of Wight who've downloaded it in a week. That's a great step forward.
One last try. Are we developing a second app or not?
As far as I'm aware, we're not developing a second app, but we are paying attention to the other apps that exist elsewhere in the world. And if we need to adapt our app or move to a different model, obviously we will do. We want the best app.
This R rate, which is a difficult thing to talk about in many ways, but it's going up at the moment, and that is because of the outbreaks in care homes. Now, we know that people have been sent to care homes from hospitals without being tested first, and we can see the results of that. But does it also mean that the rest of us are going to have to go through lockdown for longer because of what is happening in care homes?
Well, the situation in care homes has been extremely challenging. We all know that, and our heart goes out to everybody who works in care homes as well as the residents. We have a clear strategy for care homes. One element of that is a better discharge policy with the NHS, and that means that no one will go to a care home unless they are known to be free of the virus or have been either in hospital or another setting for 14 days. So that is a big step forward. We're also working on the movement of staff and people coming in and out of care homes, again, so you bring fewer people into the home and shield homes which have not yet had outbreaks. And the testing, which I spoke about earlier, will also be important because we're testing residents and staff of care homes, including the asymptomatic. There is now a comprehensive strategy for care homes, and I want to obviously see each of the elements of that rolled out as quickly as possible.
All right, very briefly, you saw David Spiegelhalter pull on his taxi boots and jump all over your daily press conferences. Are you going to rethink as a government the way you present these numbers?
Well, I'm sure there's ways we can improve those press conferences. They continue to get large audiences, but they're designed to inform the public. If there are better ways of presenting the numbers, and I very strongly respect the professor, if we can do that, we should and will do that.
All right, Robert Jenrick, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Thanks to all of my guests. I'll be back here next week. Goodbye.
My son is severely disabled. He